Nicholas "Nick" Hale had spent his entire life building an empire. At 52, he was a man of discipline, structure, and control. His company, Hale Industries, was one of the leading names in real estate investment, and he was known for his ability to anticipate every outcome. Nick had mastered the art of negotiation, turned failing businesses into gold mines, and never let emotions interfere with logic. But all it took was one quiet evening, one unplanned dinner in an unremarkable restaurant, for his carefully crafted world to shatter. That night, Nick had deliberately stepped away from his usual routine. He had spent the last few weeks traveling between New York and Los Angeles, caught in an endless loop of meetings, boardrooms, and conference calls. Tonight, however, he wanted something different. Instead of the usual high-end steakhouse or private club where deals were struck over aged bourbon, he found himself drawn to a small family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of town. The place was warm and welcoming, the kind of restaurant where regulars were greeted by name and waitresses bustled between tables with a genuine smile. The scent of fresh bread and grilled steak filled the air, blending with the quiet hum of conversations. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: home. He chose a table by the window, away from the crowd, and ordered a steak, medium rare, with a glass of red wine. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. No urgent emails, no phone calls demanding his attention. Just a quiet evening to sit, breathe, and reflect. Then he heard it. A soft, trembling sob cut through the gentle murmur of the restaurant. Nick glanced up, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on a small figure near the counter. A little girl, no older than 4, sat on the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped her face with balled-up fists. Dark curls framed her round face, and even from across the room, he could see the brightness of her tear-filled blue eyes. Something in his chest tightened. Nick wasn't the kind of man who got involved in personal matters. He had spent decades ensuring that emotions didn't cloud his judgment. Yet, something about this little girl sitting alone on the floor of a busy restaurant, looking so small and lost, made it impossible to turn away. He pushed back his chair and stood, crossing the room in a few strides. He crouched down beside her, careful not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him with wide, tear-streaked eyes. "I'm lost," she whispered. Nick felt an unexpected pang of concern. He had expected to hear something like, "I dropped my toy" or "I spilled my drink." But lost, that was different. He glanced around, expecting to see a frantic parent searching for her, but no one seemed to notice she was missing. That only made his concern grow. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The girl hesitated, then wiped her nose with the sleeve of her tiny sweater. "Lily." Nick nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. Where's your mom?" Her lips wobbled, and she shook her head. "She was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back, but then I couldn't find her." Nick exhaled slowly, piecing together what had likely happened. If her mother worked here, she had probably stepped away for just a moment, expecting Lily to stay in one spot. And Lily, being a small child in a busy restaurant, had wandered off instead. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to help. He could have called a waitress over and let them handle it. But something about Lily's wide, frightened eyes kept him in place. "Your mom works here?" he asked. Lily nodded. "She's a waitress." That confirmed it. Nick looked around again, scanning the staff. A few waitresses were moving between tables, their trays balanced on their arms, but none seemed to be looking for a child. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's find her together, okay?" Lily hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of her tiny fingers surprised him. Nick Hale, a man who had built an empire on cold calculations and careful decisions, wasn't used to holding something so small, so delicate. It felt unfamiliar. Yet, as they walked together through the restaurant in search of Lily's mother, he had no idea that this simple decision, this one quiet moment, would change his life forever. Nick Hale had always believed in control. He had spent his life ensuring that every decision he made was calculated, every move intentional. Yet, as he stood in a small, family-owned restaurant, staring into the familiar yet startled eyes of Rose, his carefully constructed world began to crumble. His gaze flickered between her and the little girl wrapped in her arms, the same girl he had just comforted, the same girl who had trusted him without question. The little girl with his eyes. His voice came out low, rough. "Is she my daughter?" Rose's arms instinctively tightened around Lily. She had imagined this moment before, but no amount of preparation could have made it easier. Nick took a slow step forward, his broad frame tense. "Tell me the truth." The weight of 4 years pressed down on Rose's chest. Lying was no longer an option. She swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "She's yours." Nick barely heard the noise of the restaurant around him. The clatter of dishes, the quiet hum of conversation, all of it faded into the background. All he could hear was the echo of her words. "She's yours." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "How long?" Rose swallowed. 4 years. 4 years. Nick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as if trying to process the impossible. He looked at Lily, who was watching them both with quiet curiosity, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just erupted around her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. Rose's fingers curled against Lily's back. "Because you had your whole life ahead of you. You were building an empire. You had investors, meetings, deals worth millions. You were traveling across the world, barely stopping for anything." She broke off, shaking her head. "I didn't want to be the one who held you back." Nick let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Held me back?" His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. "You didn't think I had the right to make that choice for myself?" Rose's throat tightened. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" His voice was lower now, rougher. "You decided for me, Rose. You decided that I didn't deserve to know my own daughter." She flinched, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like," Nick shot back. "Tell me how you justified keeping her from me for 4 years." Rose exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. "I was scared," she admitted. "I was scared that you would see her as a mistake. That you would feel trapped. That you would resent both of us." Nick's expression flickered for a second, but then his jaw tightened again. "You don't know that." "You're right," Rose whispered. "I don't. Because I never gave you the chance." A heavy silence stretched between them. Nick turned back to Lily, who was still nestled in her mother's arms, playing absently with the hem of her sleeve. She had no idea what was happening, no idea how much had just changed. Nick crouched down, leveling himself with her. "Hey, Lily," he said, his voice softer now. She blinked at him with those bright blue eyes, his eyes. "Hi," she said simply. Nick hesitated for a brief moment. "Do you know who I am?" Lily tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she glanced at Rose before looking back at him. "You're the nice man who helped me." Mick let out a breath, nodding. "Yeah," he said. "I'm the nice man who helped you." Then, quieter, "But I'm also something else." Lily's brow furrowed slightly. "What?" Mick swallowed, his throat feeling tight. He had spent years making million-dollar decisions without hesitation, yet these next words felt heavier than anything he had ever spoken. "I'm your dad." Lily blinked up at him. For a long second, she just stared at him, processing. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Oh." Mick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And then, to his utter surprise, Lily reached out and took his hand. Mick felt his entire body go still. Her fingers were small, delicate, warm. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale, the man who had built an empire from nothing, felt like he had just found something more important than anything he had ever built. Rose watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years fearing this moment, dreading what would happen if Nick ever found out. She had expected anger. She had expected resentment. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Lily to accept him so easily. And she hadn't expected Nick to look at their daughter the way he was looking at her now, like she was the most precious thing in the world. Nick tightened his grip around Lily's small hand, feeling something shift inside him. He had spent years negotiating high-stakes deals, standing in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the country. Yet nothing had ever made him feel as unprepared as this moment. He looked at Rose, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We need to talk," he said. "Now." Rose nodded, her own voice quiet but firm. "I know." Because no matter how much time had passed, this conversation was only the beginning. Mick Hale had spent decades building his empire. His life was structured, controlled, and calculated. But now, standing at the entrance of the park, waiting for his first real outing with his daughter, he felt a type of nervousness he had never known before. It had been 2 days since he learned the truth. 2 days since he had stared into Lily's bright blue eyes and realized she was his. And now, as he stood there, hands in the pockets of his coat, he felt something he wasn't used to feeling: uncertainty. Mick had always prided himself on knowing the next step, on predicting every outcome. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a business deal. This was his daughter. And he had no idea how to do this. A gust of cool autumn wind rustled the leaves around him, and then, at last, he saw them. Rose and Lily were walking toward him, hand in hand. Lily was talking animatedly, her tiny hands waving in the air, her curls bouncing with every step. Rose, however, looked more cautious, her shoulders slightly tense as she listened. Then Lily spotted him. She stopped mid-sentence, blinking up at him. Mick braced himself, unsure of what she would do. Would she hesitate? Would she hide behind her mother? Instead, she grinned. "You're here," she announced, tugging at Rose's hand before breaking into a run. Mick barely had time to react before she reached him, stopping just inches away. She tilted her head up at him with a curious expression. "Did you bring me a book?" Mick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Of all the things she could have said, he hadn't expected that. But somehow, it made everything feel easier. "I did," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small hardcover storybook. "Your mom told me you like fairy tales." Lily gasped dramatically, clutching her hands to her chest. "I love fairy tales." She took the book from his hands, turning it over as if it were treasure. Then she looked up at him again. "Are there dragons?" Mick crouched down to her level and nodded. "Big ones." And princesses who aren't afraid of them. Lily grinned. I like princesses who fight dragons. They're cooler than the ones who just wait for a prince. Nick chuckled, glancing up at Rose, who was watching them with a guarded expression. He could tell she was still trying to process how easily Lily had taken to him. He was just as surprised. Lily tugged on his sleeve. Can you read it to me? Of course. She grabbed his hand without hesitation and pulled him toward the swings. Nick let himself be led, still in awe of how naturally she accepted him. As they reached the playground, Lily climbed onto one of the swings, motioning for Nick to sit beside her. He did, holding the book in his lap as he opened it. Lily leaned in close, her legs kicking slightly as she waited for him to start. He began reading, his voice steady, though part of him was barely focused on the words. Instead, his mind kept drifting, to the little girl beside him, to the way she listened with such rapt attention, to the way she already trusted him without question. It was humbling, in a way nothing else had ever been. Halfway through the story, Lily suddenly reached for his sleeve, tugging it gently. You have a nice voice, she said matter-of-factly. Like a prince. Nick blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure why, but her words settled something deep inside him. Rose, who had been standing a few feet away, let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. That's a first, she murmured. Nick smirked, shaking his head before turning back to Lily. You think so? Lily nodded solemnly. Yep. A prince. Or maybe a knight. Nick leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a playful whisper. Knights fight dragons, you know. Lily's eyes widened. That means you could be one. Nick chuckled, flipping the page. Guess we'll have to find out. Rose was still watching them, her arms crossed, but there was something softer in her expression now, something that told Nick she was seeing something she hadn't expected to see. They stayed at the park for hours, playing, talking, reading more stories. When it was finally time to leave, Lily hugged Nick without hesitation, wrapping her small arms around his waist. Nick froze for half a second before gently returning the hug, something in his chest tightening at the unexpected gesture. As Rose led Lily toward the car, the little girl looked over her shoulder. Bye, night Nick, she called out, waving. Nick huffed out a laugh, shaking his head as he waved back. Rose lingered for a moment before finally meeting his gaze. That went better than I expected. Nick nodded. Yeah. It did. There was still so much to figure out, so many conversations left to have. But for the first time since all of this had started, Nick felt something close to peace. And for now, that was enough. Nick Hale had spent his life negotiating deals, calculating risks, and ensuring everything went according to plan. But sitting in Rose's modest apartment, watching his daughter color at the coffee table, he realized that nothing about this was going to be simple. 2 days had passed since their first real outing at the park, and now, for the first time, he was in her space. The apartment was small but warm, filled with signs of a life he had never been part of, framed pictures on the wall, shelves overflowing with children's books, a well-worn couch with a stack of Lily's stuffed animals piled in the corner. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt like home. And for the first time in his life, Nick realized just how little he knew about his daughter's world. Lily was sprawled on the floor, deeply focused on her latest masterpiece, crayons scattered around her. She hummed softly as she worked, her little tongue poking out in concentration. Nick leaned forward slightly. What are you drawing? Lily glanced up at him, then back down at the paper. She held it up for him to see, a simple drawing of 3 stick figures, all holding hands. One small, one medium, and one tall. "This is me," she pointed to the smallest figure. "This is Mommy." Then she tapped the tallest one. "And this is you." Nick stared at the drawing, something tight forming in his throat. His name had been on skyscrapers, on Forbes magazine covers, on contracts worth millions, but here, in crayon, beside two stick figures labeled Mommy and Lily, was a place where he had never expected to see it. Rose, who had been clearing dishes in the kitchen, glanced over, her expression unreadable. Nick forced himself to speak past the lump in his throat. "That's a really good drawing, Lily." She beamed, immediately going back to coloring. "I like drawing families." Nick exhaled slowly, his fingers running along the edge of the table. He had spent 4 years without knowing she existed. And yet, to her, he already belonged. Later that evening, after dinner, Nick found himself in the kitchen with Rose. Lily had retreated to her room, her soft giggles drifting down the hall as she played with her dolls. Nick leaned against the counter, watching as Rose rinsed a few plates. "She's comfortable with me," he said quietly. Rose nodded, drying her hands on a dish towel. "She likes you." Nick hesitated, his voice careful. "She doesn't seem angry that I wasn't here." Rose let out a quiet sigh, setting the towel down. "She's too young to be angry about something she doesn't understand." She met his gaze. "But one day, she will ask. And I won't lie to her, Nick." He nodded slowly. "I don't want you to." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Rose's voice was softer when she spoke again. "You know, she was always different from the other kids at daycare. The ones with dads would talk about them, how their dads took them fishing, or read bedtime stories, or helped them ride their bikes." She swallowed. Lily never asked why she didn't have one. Not after the first time. Nick exhaled sharply, guilt pressing down on him. Rose studied him for a moment. "Why are you really here, Nick?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms. "This isn't like you. You don't do things without a reason. You could have walked away from this and never looked back. Plenty of men would have." Nick's jaw tightened. "I'm not plenty of men." Rose sighed. "I know that. But, why? Why now?" Nick ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "Because I lost 4 years. Because I walked into that restaurant expecting nothing but a quiet meal and instead found the most important thing I never knew I had." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "Because she looked up at me with my own damn eyes, and I can't pretend she doesn't exist." Rose held his gaze for a long moment, her own defenses wavering just slightly. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Nick studied her. "Okay?" She let out a breath. "You want to be in her life? You're in. But this isn't just about you. It's about her. You can't disappear when things get complicated." "I'm not going anywhere," Nick said without hesitation. Rose searched his face, as if testing the weight of his words. Then, slowly, she nodded again. That night, as Nick sat on the couch, Lily climbed onto his lap with a book in her hands. "Will you read to me?" she asked. Nick's chest tightened, but he nodded. "Of course." As he began reading, Lily curled into him, her head resting lightly against his chest. And in that moment, Nick Hale, the man who had built his life on power and control, realized that nothing in the world mattered more than this. Nick Hale had spent his life making powerful decisions. He had built a business empire from nothing, navigated high-stakes negotiations, and secured his place among the country's wealthiest men. Yet, nothing had prepared him for fatherhood. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he learned about Lily. 2 weeks since his life had changed in the span of a single evening. And now, as he stood outside Rose's apartment, shifting his weight, he realized that this was the hardest thing he had ever done. The door opened before he could knock. Rose stood there, looking at him for a brief moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Nick entered, his sharp eyes scanning the space. It was small but cozy, familiar in a way that felt foreign to him. A bookshelf overflowing with children's books. A small dining table set for 3. A framed photo of Lily on the kitchen counter. He had spent years believing he had everything. Now, he wondered how much he had truly missed. "She's in her room," Rose said, closing the door behind him. "She's been talking about you nonstop since the park." Nick turned to face her. "That's a good sign, right?" Rose hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, it is." Before he could say anything else, tiny footsteps echoed down the hall. A second later, Lily appeared. She was wearing a bright yellow princess dress, a plastic tiara slightly crooked on her head. She stopped when she saw him, her face lighting up with a wide grin. "You came." Nick smiled, crouching slightly. "I told you I would." Lily twirled in place, the hem of her dress flaring. "I'm a princess today. But not the kind that waits for a prince, the kind that fights dragons." Nick chuckled. "That's the best kind of princess." Lily beamed. "Mommy says you're staying for dinner." Nick glanced at Rose, who was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "She insisted," Rose said, her voice neutral. Lily grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the table. "Do you like spaghetti? Mommy makes the best spaghetti." Nick let himself be led, sitting down as she climbed onto the chair beside him. "I love spaghetti," he said. "Do I get to help?" Lily gasped. "You want to help?" Nick smirked, glancing at Rose. "I think I can manage stirring a pot." Lily giggled, leaning in as if to share a very important secret. "Mommy doesn't like when people mess up her kitchen." Rose rolled her eyes. "Lily, don't scare him off before he even tries." Nick laughed, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. This moment, sitting in their home, listening to Lily talk, watching Rose pretend she wasn't amused, felt real. It felt like something he had never allowed himself to want. Something he had convinced himself he didn't need. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Lily talked the entire time, filling every silence with stories about school, her favorite books, and the way her stuffed animals had different voices when she played with them. Nick listened, fascinated by the way her mind worked. Every now and then, Rose would interject, rolling her eyes at Lily's dramatics, reminding her to actually eat instead of just talking about food. It felt normal. And Nick realized that he wanted more of this. After dinner, Lily pulled out a stack of crayons and some paper, setting up at the coffee table. Nick leaned over. "What are you drawing this time?" Lily looked up at him, then down at the paper before holding it up. 3 stick figures. 1 small. 1 medium. 1 tall. All holding hands. There was a house in the background, a sun in the corner, and a big blue sky. She pointed at each figure as she spoke. "This is me." She tapped the smallest one. "This is Mommy." Then, she tapped the tallest figure. "This is you." Nick stared at the drawing, something tight forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. Wasn't sure how to process the fact that, in her mind, he was already part of her life. Rose, who had been clearing the table, glanced over. She saw the drawing, and for the first time that evening, her expression softened. But she didn't say anything. She just let the moment sit between them, giving him space to take it in. Nick cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak past the lump. "That's a pretty amazing drawing, Lily." She beamed. "Do you like it?" Nick nodded. "I love it." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, immediately going back to coloring. Nick sat back, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life chasing success, thinking that was the only thing that mattered. But sitting here, watching his daughter draw their family on a piece of paper, he realized he had been wrong. Later that night, as bedtime approached, Lily climbed onto the couch beside him, book in hand. "Will you read to me?" she asked. Nick swallowed, but nodded. "Of course." As he opened the book, Lily curled into him, her head resting lightly against his chest. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Nick didn't feel like he was chasing something he could never catch. He wasn't negotiating a deal. He wasn't strategizing his next move. He wasn't planning his next acquisition. He was exactly where he needed to be. And he wasn't going to let it go. Nick Hale had spent his life chasing the next deal, the next opportunity, the next level of success. But sitting on the couch, holding a storybook while his daughter curled up beside him, he realized something he had never admitted before. He had spent so much time building an empire, he had never thought about building a family. Lily's small fingers traced the edges of the book as he read to her, her eyes heavy with sleep but refusing to close completely. "You're a good reader," she mumbled sleepily. Nick chuckled softly. "I've had a lot of practice." Lily blinked up at him. "You read a lot of stories?" Nick hesitated. "Contracts. Business reports. Financial projections." Those had been the only stories he had focused on for decades. But fairy tales? Bedtime stories? No. Not enough, he admitted. Lily yawned, snuggling closer. "You can read to me more." Nick swallowed, something tightening in his chest. She said it so simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Like she expected him to stay. Like she already believed he would. And in that moment, Nick knew that he would never leave her again. Rose stood in the doorway, watching. She had spent years convincing herself that this moment would never happen, that Nick Hale would never be part of Lily's life. But now, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not just obligation. Not just guilt. But love. Real, undeniable love. For Lily. For the daughter he never knew he had. And despite everything, despite the years of anger and regret, Rose felt something inside her soften. She cleared her throat. "It's bedtime, Lily." Lily groaned but didn't argue. She sat up, stretching her arms dramatically. "Okay, but only if Nick tucks me in." Nick blinked. "Me?" Lily nodded, completely certain. Nick glanced at Rose, unsure if he was overstepping. Rose hesitated but then gave a small nod. Nick smiled, standing up and scooping Lily into his arms. She giggled, wrapping her small arms around his neck as he carried her down the hall. For the first time in his life, Nick Hale tucked his daughter into bed. After Lily had fallen asleep, Nick returned to the living room. Rose was waiting, her arms crossed, watching him carefully. "You're really in this," she said quietly. Nick met her gaze. "I am." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to find a crack in his resolve. But there wasn't one. "Lily adores you," Rose finally said. "She's already attached." Nick nodded. "And I'm not going anywhere." Rose sighed, rubbing her forehead. "This is going to be complicated, Nick." Nick exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know." There were still so many unanswered questions. Where did he fit in their lives? What did this mean for their future? Could they co-parent without reopening old wounds? Neither of them had all the answers. But for the first time, they weren't running from them. As Nick stepped outside, the crisp night air hit him, but he barely noticed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing something that would always be just out of reach. Because this time, he had found something real. Something worth holding on to. And he wasn't letting go. Life often takes unexpected turns, leading us down roads we never planned to travel. For Nick, discovering he had a daughter after years of absence was a revelation that forced him to reevaluate his priorities. His journey reminds us that it's never too late to make things right. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. For those in their later years, this lesson is particularly powerful. Whether it's mending relationships with family, reconnecting with old friends, or embracing new roles we never expected, every moment is an opportunity for growth, love, and redemption. Nick's story teaches us that true success isn't measured in wealth or achievements, but in the connections we nurture and the love we share. No matter how much time has passed, it's never too late to say, "I'm here." It's never too late to be present, to show up, to start again. Because in the end, the most meaningful moments in life aren't found in boardrooms or bank accounts, they're found in the quiet moments, the bedtime stories, and the hands we choose to hold.